You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussion, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Wednesday night, sneaking in another show here. Hope y'all been enjoying the shows lately. I wanted to do one on why I stopped bashing Pope Francis. Some people call it Pope bashing, so I use that term there for the title. This came up because somebody asked me the other day about a video that I did from a few years ago where I was very harshly criticizing Pope Francis. This was shortly after my return to Catholicism from Eastern Orthodoxy. I was still dealing with some leftover rad trad tendencies, and I was still working through how to process this pontificate, how to deal with problems in the church, how to properly understand them, all kinds of things. I mean, like I said, I had gone through that radical traditional phase. It led me away from the church. I went to Eastern Orthodoxy. And of course, I didn't deal with those tendencies while in Orthodoxy because there really isn't a need to deal with how to properly deal with a pope when you're Eastern Orthodox. So it was more something that I had to deal with whenever I came back into the church. And again, somebody was asking me about this video where I was very severely criticizing Pope Francis, and I went back and watched it and I thought, wow, yeah, I do think that there's still room for criticizing Pope Francis, but I don't think that I would say the things that I said then for various reasons. And I wanted to go over what those reasons are, because some people are still wrestling with this today. They're still dealing with problems that they see from Pope Francis and bishops by extension. So really, this doesn't even have to be about Pope Francis per se. This could be just about, why I don't bash bishops, period. Prelates in the church, but especially the Pope, because I will say the Pope is certainly, although he is a bishop, there's certainly a distinction between the Pope and a bishop, given his universal capacity in office. So I want to be extra careful with the Pope, but I also want to be careful with bishops as well. And so here's why I stopped bashing them. I will criticize them constructively and charitably when necessary, but I won't do it in the way that I used to, because I think that the problem is I don't think that I used to charitably criticize them as much as I was venting with my frustrations about them. I was just frustrated, scandalized, hurt by different things that I've seen and experienced, personally experienced at the hands of wicked prelates. And again, just kind of scandalized by different things that I saw and just didn't know how to process. So I think I ended up in some cases crossing that line, and it was no longer constructive. It was no longer charitable. It was just me being frustrated and venting and being angry and overly harsh in my criticism. And it's something that I had to work through and still work through. I mean, I still have to work through dealing with being overly critical, or failing to be charitable in my criticisms. It's still an ongoing process. But here's why I felt the need to make some changes here. And here's why I don't, looking back at some of the videos that I did from a few years ago, here's why I don't think I took the right approach there, and why I've taken a different direction. For one, Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. Very important. I'm going to start with sacred scripture. And there's multiple passages that we could really go to using scripture as a foundation for this discussion, but I think just this one will suffice for now. So let me share my screen. You should be able to see it now. All right, so Acts 23, 1 through 5. This is Paul. He is standing before the Sanhedrin. So watch what Paul does. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this time, the high priest and Ananias, Ananias, I'm sorry, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. So they struck him. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." Now that's reminiscent of the language of Jesus. Jesus in Matthew 23 called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. And here now Paul is using that same language against the high priest. When Jesus used it, it wasn't a sin. He is God incarnate. He has authority over everyone. And he's also in a position to be able to say those things. Paul, however, is not in a position to say this. Watch this. And it's true. The high priest wasn't necessarily a good man. Ananias wasn't necessarily good. But watch what he says. "You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourselves violate the law by commanding that I be struck," which is, again, just repeating what Jesus told the Pharisees. But look at the next part. "Those who were standing near Paul said, 'How dare you insult God's high priest?'" Here's how Paul responds. He doesn't say, "Well, Jesus did it." Watch. Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written," and he quotes the Old Testament, "Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people." How many times have we violated that? And how many times have we done it on the basis that, well, Jesus called people whitewashed tombs? Well, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. Yeah, Paul was aware of that. And Paul obviously didn't think that he was in a position to be able to imitate Jesus in that area. And if Paul's not in that position, I'm definitely not. And, being confronted with the reality of that in Scripture convicted me severely. That might be the most important factor in the entire reason why I stopped doing it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, sacred Scripture carries the highest authority. Now, we can also speak of sacred tradition being of equal value, as Trent puts it. But when it comes to sacred Scripture, it's much more easily accessible than some aspects of sacred tradition. So it's easier to just point to Scripture. And when I look at Scripture, it doesn't seem to be in my favor. It doesn't seem to allow me that opportunity to bash popes. However, that doesn't mean that you can't criticize them constructively. Paul did that to Peter. So we can balance this out. We don't have to go to the other extreme and say, okay, well, I can't do anything. No, that's the other extreme. You can do something. Paul rebuked Peter to his face. But we have to be measured in the way it's done. It has to be done prudently, and it has to be done charitably and respectfully. But that was a huge thing for me. Another thing was continuing to study the Magisterium, working again through Donum Veritatis. I had to read it back in probably 2016, somewhere around there. But I reread through it again, the role of the theologian and how they're to behave and dealing with, the Magisterium and disagreements that they might have. Here's what it says. As for the theologians, this is again Donum Veritatis 40, looks like it's paragraph 4. As for theologians, by virtue of their own proper charisms, they have the responsibility of participating in the building up of Christ's body in unity and truth. Their contribution is needed more than ever, for evangelization on a world scale requires the efforts of the whole people of God. If it happens that they encounter difficulties due to the character of their research, they should seek their solution in trustful dialogue with the pastors in the spirit of truth and charity, which is that of the communion of the church. And again, when I would look at, some of the things I would say, I just kind of felt, okay, well, I don't think I'm being charitable. I think what I'm doing is I'm venting my frustrations. And so I need to be a little bit more measured in the way that I criticize a pope or bishops. It doesn't need to cross that line from constructive criticism to Pope bashing or bishop bashing. Now, I understand sometimes there's a fine line there, but at some point we do cross that line. And I think that that's illegitimate. Donum Veritatis certainly doesn't allow for it. There was another thing in the Code of Canon Law, and I had always quoted Canon 212 about some of this, when it comes to the frustrations that I had with Pope Francis and expressing them publicly. I always quoted Canon 212. But then it was helpful for me to go back and look at Canon 212 because, quoting Canon 212 over and over and over, you tend to sometimes forget, however, some of the other things it says, the context, the actual thing, the full thing. And here's what it says. According to the knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess, that is the laity, they have the right and even at times duty to manifest to their sacred pastors their opinion on matters which pertain to the good of the church, and to make that opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful. And I stopped there. That's pretty much all I remembered from Canon 212. But I had to go back and look at it. What does canon law say? And looking back at it, I realized, but it says a little more than that, obviously. It says, without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence towards their pastors, and attentive to the common advantage and the dignity of persons. And it's that last part that I felt, okay, well, I think sometimes I cross that line. I think sometimes I'm not being reverent towards my pastors. I'm angry with them. I'm frustrated with them, and I'm venting. And that's what it is. Now, maybe my anger is legitimate. And in some cases it was. In some cases, I think, no, I think I had some misunderstandings there. But in some cases, I was rightly angry and frustrated. The problem isn't necessarily the anger and the frustration. I think that that's a natural reaction. The problem is expressing that anger and frustration in an uncharitable way. I think that we can take anger and frustration that we have with nonsense going on in the church, a crisis in the church, sacrilege in the church. I think we can take that anger and frustration that we have and criticize it in a way that doesn't come out in a sinful way. So I'm not saying that we necessarily have to repress those things or can't even express them. I think, though, it doesn't need to cross the line into bashing and lacking charity. We need to keep our eyes focused on being constructive in this and being respectful in this. As long as we're doing that, I think that we can express our frustrations. But again, it's very easy to cross that line, especially when you're frustrated. It's easy to cross that line and to go too far, which is why it's sometimes good to just not speak about the issue until, you're kind of in a place that, okay, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna say something that I shouldn't say. I'm able to speak about this calmly. That was a big thing for me. Other things, seeing the responses of saints and how they reacted to wayward prelates. Padre Pio was a big one for me. There's occasions where somebody was bashing a bishop in front of Padre Pio, and it was a bishop who was doing some pretty messed up stuff. So the guy who was criticizing him was telling the truth, but Padre Pio smacked him, and he got onto him for bashing a bishop and speaking ill of him. Because again, I think it crossed the line from constructively criticizing to lacking charity, to being disrespectful to those who are in authority over us. Seeing that kind of behavior from saints made me pause. Similar stories from St. Francis also made me have to say, okay, I need to think through this a little bit better. Another one, Aquinas. I do have that quote in front of me. Actually, I went over it the other day in a video. Briefly, here's what Aquinas says about evil prelates. An evil prelate is unworthy to be a prelate and receive the honors due to prelates. So he's saying an evil prelate is not worthy of receiving honor. But the one whose image the present prelate bears is worthy to have his vicar honored. So what he's saying is an evil prelate doesn't deserve respect because of their personal merits, but they do deserve respect because of the office that they're in, not because they've personally merited it. He goes on to say, just as the Blessed Virgin is worthy to have a painted image of her venerated, although the image itself is not worthy of such respect. So he's kind of using icons as an example of that, which I thought was a really good example. So another thing that we have to keep in mind, and I have seen some people abuse this, but it's sometimes true. Sometimes we are misinformed about a situation. I know some people have overplayed that. There's some people who have really overplayed that card. The Pope was mistranslated or something like that. In some cases, he's not being mistranslated. It's being reported very accurately, and it's problematic what he said. But in some cases, no, he is being misreported. There might be an issue with translation. There might be an issue with hearsay. I mean, there could be a number of factors involved, and I've seen some of this myself. So I've seen cases where, okay, the reports about Pope Francis are accurate. I've seen that. And I've also seen some cases where, no, they weren't accurate. And actually, if you just took them in his context, he didn't say what you're trying to make him say. So you're not being fair to him. So because of that, that also made me have to say, okay, look, I need to be a little less quick to jump the gun here and just criticize. I need to do a little bit better in making sure that he actually says this. Another thing is we don't always know how informed he is about a situation. I think that this is certainly the case with Father James Martin. He's made some endorsements of very general endorsements of Father James Martin. And I think we could criticize that, but then we also have to ask the question, how informed is he about some of the specifics of James Martin? Because what I've seen from James Martin is he's really good at presenting his case within the bounds of orthodoxy among certain groups. And then among other groups, he's able to do some other things. So I kind of wonder, what exactly was Pope Francis informed about Father James Martin? I don't know. So I do kind of have to give him the benefit of the doubt there. You have to err on the side of charity. You have to err on giving someone the benefit of the doubt rather than not giving them that judgment of charity. That's just another thing that I've had to work through and still work through. Giving somebody the judgment of charity rather than assuming, especially when it comes to a bishop or a pope, somebody who's in that position of authority over me. Although even, others who aren't in a position of authority over me, they also are entitled to being represented fairly. So, I mean, if I've misrepresented somebody who, is not a bishop or something like that, that's not okay either. I mean, everybody is entitled to being represented accurately and fairly. That's just part of the virtue of justice and charity. Another thing is sometimes it could be that the Pope knows, or even a bishop knows about a situation, and they know some things that we don't know. I've come across this before, where I've had inside information about what a bishop knows about a particular person. And to the public, it looks like they're persecuting this priest. The bishop is persecuting the priest. But then sometimes I have inside information where, no, I actually know that there's some things going on behind the scenes. And no, that priest is not as innocent as you might think. And the bishop knows that. But the bishop is not at liberty to disclose that publicly. So he just has to sit there and get criticized by people on the internet all day long. Because he's not at liberty to disclose what's going on with that priest and why he's taking the measures that he's taking. So sometimes that's a factor with bishops, with a pope. Sometimes they know things that we don't know. So again, it's kind of the benefit of the doubt thing. However, sometimes that only goes so far. In some cases, it's clear that, okay, that isn't the case. There's something really wrong going here, and in that case, we do need to criticize them in certain contexts, I would think, but we need to do it charitably and respectfully. I'm not taking the position just bury your head in the sand. I've never taken that position, although people tend to accuse me of that. But they're the people who don't watch my show and don't listen to anything I have to say. I don't take the position of burying your head in the sand. I think that's also going to the other extreme, because in some cases we have a duty to say something, and in fact, that's what we read from Canon 212. In certain contexts, we as laity do have a duty to speak up, but we have to use prudence in what case, in what setting, and to what extent, with what words. How am I going to do that? That's where we start to get into trouble, because sometimes we're criticizing something that needs to be criticized, but we're doing it in a way that we shouldn't do. Another thing, again, mentioning my study of the Magisterium, which is still ongoing, obviously, but my studying of the Magisterium has made me have to also rethink some of the criticisms that I've had about Pope Francis, because the further I looked into it, the more I realized, okay, well, maybe this particular issue isn't that foreign to the historical perspective. Maybe what Pope Francis is expressing here has actually been expressed previously and in other eras by very traditional figures. And so sometimes putting some of that in context, the more you learn about the Magisterium, sometimes you realize, okay, well, maybe I was a little too harsh in my criticisms on this or that particular statement of Pope Francis. I see you there in the chat, Lyndon. No problem. Byzantine bros for life. But yeah, that played, again, a factor. It helps put some of the things of Pope Francis into better perspective. Another thing is studying church history more. I mean, I've been studying church history for a while now, but continuing to study church history, being confronted with some other aspects in church history that make it a little bit more understandable, some of the things that are being said, or some of the things that are happening. It just kind of puts things in perspective a little bit. That's helped me kind of digest and deal with some of the problems in the church today, kind of putting it in perspective and realizing that there was no golden era in the church. There's always been problems in the church, and sometimes those problems were much more severe than I thought that they were. That helps put today into perspective. And I had to start asking the question, okay, well, would I have been able to be a Catholic in that day at that time, given all that was going on then? And when you start asking questions like that, then you become a little bit more patient with some of the things that you see today, or some of the failures that you see today among the bishops. Additionally to that, some of the aspects of the Magisterium, like a general protection or an integral protection or a protection of the integral mission of the church, as Donum Veritatis puts it, and other manualists, which I've noted, in a recent stream, actually. I think it was a stream on, "Are the disciplinary decrees of the church harmful to souls?" I think is the title of it. Studying through things like that helped me work through some of the problems that I was also seeing with the church. So it made me have to dial back some of my criticisms there. This idea of a safety to the liturgical and disciplinary universal decrees of the church. And then, of course, something that I actually learned from my father, and that is, erring on the side of grace rather than violating charity. You would rather err on the side of being too charitable than, violating charity. I'm not saying I'm always successful at it. I have an inclination to be to be critical. So for me, I have to really work on being charitable. Being charitable does not come naturally to me. No surprise there. But that doesn't give any kind of excuses. Just because there's a disposition to criticism doesn't allow for being overly critical or, uncharitable in one's criticism. So erring on the side of grace has been something that has convicted me as well. And I've had to say, okay, well, look, if I'm ever uncertain, I need to err on the side of grace rather than err on the side of violating charity. So again, I'm not saying bury your head in the sand, but what I'm saying is, given all that, I've realized I have to be a little bit more prudent. I have to be constructive. I can't just start venting. I can't just, let my anger take over me and I just end up saying things that I shouldn't say, that are overly harsh, overly critical. So that's, some of the reasons why I stopped Pope bashing. Another huge one, is seeing the effects it had on people. I saw the effects it had on myself, but also seeing it in other people and really connecting those dots. I realized this ended up making people lean to despair and lacking hope. It ended up bringing people to a place where they experience a very, dark place. They're just so emotionally distraught and frustrated and angry that they just want to leave the church. Seeing that, the actual effects and fruits of, overdoing it and being, to a point where you're bashing the bishops and bashing the Pope, seeing that made me think, okay, there's something not right here. I need to figure out what's going on. This isn't right. The fruit of this isn't right. And that's partly why I've had to kind of look back through these things over the last few years and start working on, okay, well, I need to give people the judgment of charity, especially when it comes to those who are in authority over me. So that's why I've done videos about the judgment of charity. That's why I've done these videos over the last few years, is because those are just some of the things that I was learning and still am learning. And I thought that other people need to learn them as well, because we can end up going to a point that this turns into something sinful. And that's certainly not what we want. Because if we are going to criticize a pope or a bishop, what are we trying to criticize? Well, we're trying to criticize something that we think is sinful, an aspect on their part that we think is wrong. Okay, but how are we going to do that if we're engaging in sin ourselves? Another thing when it comes to pope bashing that convicted me is that I had to start asking the question, do I do the same thing as Pope Francis? And in some cases, I realized, you know what? In some ways, I am. Okay, so for example, if I think that Pope Francis is not tending to his flock as well as he should, okay, let me ask a question. Am I doing the same? Am I tending to my family in the way that I should? When you start asking those questions, am I taking care of the people that are under my authority in the way that I should? When you start asking those questions, it makes you have to start saying, okay, well, I need to step it up there. Because at the end of the day, I have no leg to stand on. If I'm going to criticize somebody for failing to be a good pastor, if I'm failing to be a good shepherd to those who are in authority under me, well, so that's a problem, So it's again back to what Jesus talks about when he mentions, take the take the plank out of your own eye before you deal with the speck of sawdust in someone else's eye. Well, I mean, we have to deal with those problems first, but when we start asking those questions, am I doing the same thing as them? Albeit in a different context. I'm not a pope, but Am I failing in some of my duties in the same way that I am seeing failure in somebody else? Maybe. And if so, okay, well, I need to step it up and work on that because I'm in no position to criticize somebody else who's doing it. So let me take care of that, and then maybe I can come back and address this charitably and constructively. But I'm clearly not in a position to do it if I'm failing to do it. Put some questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Make sure to put them to @Reason in Theology. Obviously, keep it on topic. So relevant to Pope bashing, relevant to anything I've said in the past. Something along those lines. Not is the essence and energies compatible with Thomism. Save that for another stream. Catholic Disciple says, thank you, Michael, for all your work. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, this is another good point from AD. Even David in the midst of Saul would not disrespect the Lord's anointed. Our bishops are anointed and consecrated at their ordination. We ought to show reverence like David. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like there's other biblical passages. Obviously, David with Saul is one of them. Another one is Michael the Archangel with Satan. If you look at the book of Jude, let's go to it together. Let's see. It's going to be verse 9. Let's start at 8. Let me share my screen. In the very same way, on the strength of their dreams, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies, reject authority, sound familiar, and heap abuse on celestial beings. So some of these people were not only rejecting authority, but were cursing angels. And it seems that they were cursing demonic angels. But even the Archangel Michael, when he was disputing with the devil about the body of Moses, did not himself dare to condemn him for slander, but said, the Lord rebuke you. In other words, Michael the Archangel, as mighty as he is, did not say, I rebuke you. He said, the Lord rebuke you. Yet these people slander whatever they do not understand, and the very things they do not understand by instinct, as irrational animals do, will destroy them. Woe to them, they have taken the way of Cain. They have rushed for the prophet into Balaam's error. They have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion, which these were all figures in the Old Testament that were, Balaam was outside of God's people. Korah's rebellion, that was a rebellion against lawful authority. So, yeah, that's a good one. David and Saul, Michael the Archangel and Satan. Those were passages that convicted me, and I had to say, okay, I need to find a balanced approach here, because I don't need to go to the extreme that I'm burying my head in the sand and I don't say anything, because I have a duty to say something in certain contexts. So I don't want to go there, but I also don't feel comfortable with some of the things that I'm saying or have said, because I think that I'm going too far. So I need to find a way that I can balance this. And that's kind of what brought me to reforming some of these things. Let's continue through the chat here. Okay. Have I been following Pope Francis's trip to Canada? Not a whole lot. I saw one of the ceremonies that he was in. One of the Native American things. But that was it. I haven't really followed it in much detail. Let's see. Do you think mass media today makes the current crisis more harmful than in the past, like Arianism and false popes? I think that they certainly make it more visible. I'm not convinced that today's crisis, although I used to be convinced of this, but I'm no longer convinced that today's crisis is the most extreme crisis we've been through. It's certainly unique. I don't know if it's the worst crisis we've been through. It's definitely up there. But I can think of some other instances in church history which were pretty severe. And they didn't have mass media like we do today. I could only imagine if we had mass media back then, what all we would uncover about some of the popes. We think, that some of these popes were harmless, but I can only imagine some of the things that would be uncovered if we had social media. Reason and theology, are you a glad trad? That's definitely one way to put it. Yeah. What do we mean by trad? I think a trad is anybody who's faithful to the magisterium. So I think every Catholic who is faithful to the magisterium is a traditionalist. But I know that that's not how everybody defines the term traditionalist. Some people defined it in the way that Timothy Flanders does from Meaning of Catholic. In our discussion that we had on radical traditionalism, and no, I used to be in that camp. I used to be the Rad Trad camp. But again, working through the magisterium, working through different issues of church history, has made me have to say, okay, I think that's a dead end, and there's some things up in that camp that just goes too far, obviously. Not that everything they have to say is wrong, not that every criticism that they have to say is wrong. It's not what I'm saying. Don't beat yourself up, dude. Texan gentleman says, I'm not. I've been to confession over all this. I went to confession a few years ago about it, because I ended up feeling like really convicted, especially in light of scripture and stuff like that, and examinations of conscience. And I ended up going to confession and confessing that I've been overly harsh and critical of the Pope and bishops. So I've confessed it. It's not on my conscience anymore. It doesn't bother me. I bring it up for the sake of those who would benefit from why I'm no longer doing this. And also for anybody who's curious, well, Michael, you used to say this. You used to say these things about Pope Francis. You used to take this approach, or you used to say this about this or that group. And this is why I've changed. This is partly why. There's other reasons as well. Again, mostly my studying of the magisterium. Okay. Have you heard the term monsters and miters said about bishops, and how are terms like this so widely accepted as okay? It just seems not even the apostles called Judas a monster. I actually haven't heard that term before, monsters and miters. I mean, I don't doubt that people are using that term. I'm just saying I haven't heard it before. I've heard way worse than that, but I haven't heard that term specifically. Thanks for the positive charitable attitude. It really helps in the current situation. I'm trying. I can't guarantee I will always execute charity well. I'm trying. But in the cases where I don't execute charity well, I go to confession over it. I definitely confess it, so I don't leave that out there, and I'll also usually say something publicly to try to repair those things, because it's kind of like gossip. You gossip about somebody. Well, you can go to confession, yeah, but the damage has been done. The damage to that person's reputation has been done, and you might be able to do certain acts of penance, but can you really undo gossip? Once you put it out there, it's there. And I've been guilty of that before, which I've confessed, and others have done it to me. So it's similar to that. So whenever I've made those mistakes, I've tried to repair them the best that I can. Let's see. Everyone needs to watch Bishop Barron's documentary on St. Francis. Very, very relevant to this topic. I have not seen that. Let's see. Okay. Okay, here's a good question from Jared. Does this analysis apply equally to civil authorities as it does church authorities, or is there a distinct honor respect to be given to them? Well, I mean, first of all, obviously there's a difference between a civil authority and a church authority insofar as those who are called to the office in the church, I think, are called to a higher calling, not putting down those who are civil service. I'm just saying that there's a higher calling for those who are, um, in ministry. However, that being said, I do think that those biblical passages apply because the scripture that Paul quoted was in the context of their civil leader. And, the situation with David and Saul was in the context of a civil leader. And the situation with Michael and the devil is in neither context. So I do think this applies also to our civil authorities, which is why I try to be measured in the criticisms that I have of politicians. So, for example, I'll criticize Nancy Pelosi and some of her behavior, but I won't start, calling her names and condemning her to hell and stuff like that. That's where I think we cross the line. So, yes, it applies to them as well. That being said, we can say that, and we can warn people about the danger of hell, but I don't think that we can make any definitive judgments on their soul. Okay. We all make mistakes. Don't trip over it. Yeah. Well, I've made a lot of them. Trying to learn from them, though. Okay. Well. Okay, so Yusuf asks, as a Muslim who doesn't know much about the Pope, is he equivalent to a Caliph leader? Not exactly. There's some similarities there, but not exactly. We would actually say that the Pope has a higher authority than maybe a Caliph. But that's a really good question. Now, I'm certainly not an expert on Islam. I can definitely tell you that Louis Dizon, who's on my channel all the time and will be on the channel tomorrow with a live stream on Islam, can answer that in more detail. So if you visit the channel tomorrow with the show that I have with Louis Dizon at 3 p.m. Central, ask that in the chat and I'll have him answer it as well, because he can give you a more informed differences between the two. But insofar as I understand them, no. There's certainly some similarities there, but it's not exactly the same. Looking through the chat. Lots of comments. But just trying to see if there's any questions. This is funny. Alexander Evans says, how am I supposed to defend you against the charge of hyperpapalism now? Yeah, look, this is the problem, right? People can't be balanced. Unless you're a Pope basher, you're a hyperpapalist. It's just... I know what you're dealing with, Alexander. I know the kind of people you're engaging and dealing with. Believe me, I share your frustrations. I understand. Yeah, that isn't that the part of the problem. That people aren't able to balance those out. Either you're a hyperpapalist, either you're perfectly fine with everything, or you're Pope bashing. Well, why can't we have something in the middle? But you will still be able to defend me against hyperpapalism, obviously, because I do have videos where I've criticized Pope Francis, and I've done so charitably. However, at least I've attempted to. And I don't think a hyperpapalist would do that. So maybe you could point to those. Let's see. Looking through. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it. Hold on. My screen is refreshing here. How do we know that Michael Lofton has been has or hasn't been? Okay, has been secretly swapped with his evil twin, Michael Lofton. Michael Lofton. That's hilarious. It's like fake sister Lucy. Yeah, I can't give you any kind of reassurance that I haven't been swapped with Michael Lofton. I mean, I don't know how to substantiate the proof of my identity to that extent. By the way, speaking of some of those absurd claims, somebody again, just I think it was yesterday or it may have been today. I don't remember. Yesterday or today. Once again in the comment section, and they were being serious. Was trashing me and everything, and then they talked about how I'm using a fake green screen for my background for my books and everything. How can you reason with people like that? You can literally walk up to the books, take them off the shelf, and they'll still say something stupid like that. So you just can't reason with some people. Let's see. We don't seem to hear any harsh comments by the apostles of Judas. Do you think this was done out of charity and this is a model for us on how to treat the successors of the apostles? That's fair. There's definitely some application there. I mean, Peter does speak about how he went to his place, his appointed place. But I think that that's within the bounds of charity. There were some instances where the apostles have said some pretty strong things about others, but they weren't other apostles. So I think that, yeah, you are pointing out a good point here. T in the chat says, at least Michael has real books. Texas gentleman says, again with the green screen claim. Yep, again. Let's see. How do you think things will go in the church right now if Pope Francis's health continues to decline to the point that soon he is completely out of action? Already he has a wheelchair. What do you mean? Like if he's just not doing well and he's not able to really shepherd the church, and what do I think will happen? I mean, there are others who are able to step in and take over to a certain extent. They can't do everything, but to a certain extent, they can handle some of the day-to-day issues of a pope whenever he's, not doing well physically. What do I think will happen? I don't know. I'm a little bit more concerned about what's going to happen whenever the next pope is elected. I don't think it's going to be any better. Let's see. Michael Lofton uses aluminum books. Is that right? Aluminum books. Never heard of it. There's a comment here. If you have a green screen, why don't you put some orcs and goblins and stuff? That's a good point. I mean, if I do have a green screen. I think it's behind the stuff over here. I'd have to get it out. But, why use the green screen when I can just use the books? Do I think Taylor Marshall is used as a mouthpiece of trad bishops? I don't know. I mean, I know that there's some, I think, more radical leaning bishops that are perfectly fine with Taylor Marshall, but I don't know what their relationship with him is specifically. Okay, well, I think that's going to do it, y'all. Appreciate y'all participating there in the chat. Really enjoyed it. Hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section whenever this posts on YouTube. Just put your comments there. Also, of course, as I always say, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Let me know what your thoughts were about the show. And as always, check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology. You get access to extra content and it supports me. See you later. God bless. Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason in Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.